you're seeing now is a 49-inch beast of a gaming monitor that packs in mini LED HDR 2000, a 240Hz refresh rate, and 5K resolution. There has never been a better spec sheet on a gaming display before, period. So this should be a slam dunk positive review, right? Well, no, actually. This is indeed a very good monitor, and it's one that will make gamers beam for days. But this is a prime example of a niche product, and one that you shouldn't really buy until you've seen this review. So strap yourselves in, let's get started, after a short word from this video's sponsor. The NZXT H1 is now in stock, and it fits the ultimate PC gaming experience into a tiny 14-litre chassis. This gorgeous enclosure lets your components do the talking, with tempered glass for looks and a mesh side panel for airflow. It is so easy to build inside, as both the power supply and the all-in-one liquid cooler do come pre-installed, so say goodbye to ITX frustration. Get yours today with the link down below. The Samsung Odyssey Neo is a huge display, and it's one that you'll often see listed as 5K. It's a bit of a weird one, as yes, it does in fact have over 5,000 lines of pixels, but it arranges them across a super ultra-wide 49-inch screen size, which actually makes this two 1440p displays that are sandwiched together. This isn't going to give you the ultimate level of pixel density, it's not even 4K in this regard, but it is insanely useful for productivity, as you can effectively have a bezel-free multi-monitor setup that's all powered through one plug socket. Think about this from the game streamer's perspective too, or maybe you want to use your PC whilst playing on a console at the same time. There's a lot of flexibility here, and it gives you a really nice clean looking desk setup. Realistically though, this is quite literally only half the selling point, because a super ultra-wide display is all about that full screen, ultra immersive gameplay, and boy does this thing deliver. The form factor isn't anything new, in fact the older generation G9 had this exact same setup, but it still blows my mind every single time I fire up a game on this thing. The extra width that you gain out of this just straight up sucks you in, and it brings you more into the game than any other display, VR notwithstanding. I've been playing a lot of racing games on this, mainly some F1 2021, and it is absolutely delicious. Disclaimer, don't eat your gaming monitor, no matter how big it is. It helps a lot that the screen is so curved, as unlike most ultra-wides, this truly wraps around your vision, which properly aids that instant whack of impact. It's not just racing games either, as any optimized story game works in a fairly similar fashion. Jedi Fallen Order, for example, does not have any added practicality from this resolution, but the extra amount of screen real estate just feels better, and it brings you closer to the action than ever before. But here's where we get into that first reason why this display isn't quite as perfect as you might think, because not all games play nice with super ultra-wide. You might think that I'm talking about technicalities, where games like Valorant just won't display on such a wide screen. But in actual fact, I'm just talking straight usability. If you are a regular player of multiplayer FPS, then I would honestly think very carefully about whether you want to invest in something like this, because I know that if I bought this display, to be honest, I'd be a bit disappointed. It is such a shame, because on paper, things look great. What with that 240Hz refresh rate, this should be a beast at FPS, right? Well, sadly not, as while games like Far Cry 5 are actually very playable here, multiplayer titles are generally not, as they will never fit the screen properly. The reason for this makes sense, as by having two screens worth of width, you've essentially got twice the field of view as other players, and thus you'd gain an unfair advantage. In practice, games like Apex Legends will essentially cut off some of the vertical width, and then stretch the edges to form what I would call a puke-inducing wrap. You can get used to this to some extent, but there's not really any reason why you'd want to. There's no way any competitive player watching this would want to swap to this panel. There are ways around it. You could just play at 1440p and just use the middle section of the screen, but obviously if you're in this situation, why not just buy a much cheaper display, be it 16:9 or normal ultra-wide, and then you won't run into any of these issues. Ultimately, the biggest problem with this display is that we as gamers tend to play a mix of things, so unless you're only playing racing or sim games, you are going to have to put up with some of these quirks here and there. And speaking of quirks, let's flip this gaming monitor coin over and talk about the other reason you'd be buying it, HDR performance. Generally speaking, things are pretty good in SDL modes, as after calibration, this VA panel hits all of the key notes for great image quality. But this display is all about high dynamic range, as after all, this uses a mini LED backlight. 2048 tiny zones all across the display, up from just 10 on the last model. A hilarious difference, and one that transforms this from a decent display into a spectacular one. 2000 nits of peak brightness is pure insanity, but fortunately for all of our eyeballs out there, it rarely gets this bright, instead offering a true-to-life image that highlights areas of light when needed, whilst keeping the darks, well, in the dark. Driving around Night City in Cyberpunk was easily the clearest example of this display working at its absolute best, with a city coming alive in a way that I've just never really quite seen before. The image just pops, with the extra contrast and highlighting adding a natural sense of depth, which when mixed with that huge display, gives you an all-round wicked experience. And yet, something just isn't quite right about it. It's very subtle and it's very hard to say exactly what the issue is, but it doesn't blow your mind like a 2000 nit mini LED monitor should. Far Cry, for example, can look absolutely incredible during the day, but then at night it just gets a little bit murky. This could partly be down to Windows 10's still very lackluster HDR implementation. I think things will get better if you swap to Windows 11, but realistically I think the problem slightly lies down to the tone mapping, or at least the way that the mini LED backlight works, because it's not as impactful for as long as it should be, and there are times that you move the camera around and then the whole screen sort of goes dark, and then you move it around and then everything becomes super bright. The whole thing is just so peculiar because technically speaking, I haven't seen any obvious signs of bleeding or blooming in game, so quite why this doesn't have that proper mini LED magic I'm not entirely sure. It just doesn't work as seamlessly as I think it can do, so here's hoping a firmware update does actually help things along a bit. I realise at this stage that I haven't actually touched on input lag, ghosting or blur yet. At 240Hz, there's not a huge amount of blur, but there's still a bit more than you're likely to get from smaller 16:9 displays, especially ones that are IPS or VA. Speaking practically though, this really isn't a problem in the slightest, but it is a shame that enabling Gsync or Freesync does disable the response time setting from being changed in the OSD. Any reason for this, Samsung? Ultimately, the big question is whether I would recommend this and whether you should buy it. And it's a bit of a muddy one because it's really obvious if you're just into racing or simulation games and you want to equip this with like a wheel or a flight stick or anything like that, this is going to give you like the top end experience. Unless you want to go for VR, I don't think there's anything better than this. Having said that though, the issue for you would then become price, not only for the monitor itself, which as I say is around about 1800 quid, but also in terms of the PC that you need to drive it. And to be clear, I've been using an RTX 3080 with this, and I haven't got 240Hz in any game at all. Almost just as much of a no-brainer if you're really into your competitive multiplayer gaming, especially if you're playing FPS, then I remain firm that this is probably a no. Even if you're bad at games and you just play casual anyway, honestly there are much better choices out there for you. Real talk for a second, there is going to be loads of hype around this display, but you need to look through all of that and know whether this is going to fit into your lifestyle, because I would absolutely hate for someone to invest all of this money and then be disappointed. And honestly, it's not out of the question. Can your desk and your playstyle actually accommodate this? And ultimately, is it going to be a good use of your money, assuming you can afford a super expensive monitor in the first place? Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this video, get yourself subscribed, and if you do want to check out current pricing, then you can find this with my affiliate links that are listed down below. And of course, while you're down there, don't forget to bask in the beauty of the NZXT H1. Available in both black and white, this ITX enclosure lets you fit and ventilate powerful graphics cards whilst making it easier than ever to build a small system. Stop compromising with the NZXT H1. Grab yours today with that link down below. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.